An ordinary man's life has drastically changed since a flock of eagles began to chase him literally everywhere. When the man had finally found out the reason for this, being amazed at the revealed truth, he burst into tears. This story began in a small port town on the West Coast. Michael Thornton worked as a foreman in the busy seaport. His days passed in the monotone rhythm of loading and unloading ships. He lived alone in a modest house near the port. Every morning, Michael woke up at 5:30 a.m. so that he would be in time for the first shift. His apartment was on the second floor of an old brick house. The windows in his bedroom overlooked the sea. Michael frequently woke up from the cries of seagulls. The house had only the most necessary furniture: a metal bed, a shabby sofa, a small TV, and a simple kitchen area. There were photographs of ships hanging on the walls. Michael worked in the port for 10 years already. During this time, he learned all the loading procedures by heart. He knew every corner of the pier. Michael remembered the names of all the captains of regular flights. He was valued for his attentiveness and responsibility. His colleagues valued him for his fairness and frankness. At the beginning of October, that day turned out to be very cold. The sea wind pierced to the bone. The sky was covered with gray clouds. Michael put on his old work jacket. He took a thermos with hot coffee with him. The air smelled of salt and algae. The waves crashed loudly against the concrete blocks of the pier. The first thing Michael did after arriving at work was to check the schedule of the ships. 3 cargo ships were expected to arrive this day. He went to the pier to check the mooring equipment. Above the water, the morning fog gradually cleared. The sun rose, barely above the horizon. That was when Michael saw a lone bald eagle on the edge of the dock. The bird sat motionless as a statue. Her snow-white head was a contrast to her dark plumage. The eagle seemed unusually large. His sharp gaze was fixed on the water. Claws gripped the metal edge of the pier tightly. Michael stopped a few meters from the bird. He had never seen eagles this close. In the morning light, the plumage of the bird glittered bronze. The eagle turned his head and looked directly at Michael. Their eyes met for several long seconds. At that moment, the man remembered his breakfast. In the bag was a ham sandwich. He slowly pulled it out, trying not to make too sudden movements. The eagle carefully followed every gesture of the man. His head turned slightly, following the man's movements. To his surprise, the bird did not fly away when Michael carefully placed the piece of meat on the edge of the dock. Instead, the eagle leaned his head to one side. His amber eyes studied the food offered. Then the bird made one cautious step forward. Its claws tapped softly on the concrete. The eagle was moving smoothly and carefully. Michael held his breath. The bird approached the meat. In one fell swoop, the eagle grasped the food and then retreated. He quickly swallowed all the offered treats and flew away. The next day, the eagle appeared again. To Michael's great surprise, he was sitting in the same place. Even his posture was exactly the same. Michael, as if expecting this meeting, bought fresh meat in a store on his way to work. This time the bird came a little faster. There was something confident in her movements. Some days later, Michael's colleagues pointed out his strange behavior. They would see him every morning feeding the eagle. Some said that was dangerous, others were curious. The shift supervisor warned Michael to be careful, but nobody forbade him from feeding the bird. In a week, the eagle was already taking food directly from Michael's hands. It required implicit trust from the two sides. Michael learned to hold meat properly, and the eagle to take food very carefully so as not to touch a person with its claws. News about a man who had tamed the wild eagle spread quickly around the port. The dockers specially came early to see it with their own eyes. The photos of Michael with the eagle appeared on the bulletin board. He even began to be called the Lord of Eagles. One morning, Michael found not one, but 5 eagles at once. They sat at different levels of the pier. All the birds were similar, yet each had its own characteristics. One eagle was noticeably larger than the others. The other had a small scar on his beak. Not only weren't the birds afraid of Michael, but they followed him through the port. When he entered the building, the birds circled over its roof. When the ships were unloaded, eagles sat on the containers. They didn't show aggression. They just watched what was going on. The situation was becoming stranger and stranger. Soon, eagles started to appear near the house where Michael lived. They sat on the neighboring roofs. Their silhouettes showed up against the sunset sky. In the mornings, they escorted him to work, flying at a safe distance. The more curious Michael became about wild birds' strange behavior day by day, the more he decided to install a small camera with a GPS tracker. It was a very risky task, but that was the only way to find out the truth. Then he put a piece of meat on the ground and made a few careful movements so that it could be attached to the paw of the biggest eagle. The data obtained from the tracker showed an amazing picture. The eagles flew between the port, the house, and an area 15 kilometers from the city. Their route was accurate and repeated almost every day. The birds moved as if along an invisible line. The port authorities expressed dissatisfaction with the constant presence of eagles. Birds distracted workers. Clients complained about their dangerous proximity. Because eagles would occasionally sit on the containers, cargo would at times be delayed. The situation needed an immediate remedy. The harbor director summoned Michael to his office. In that conversation, few words were said but harsh ones. Michael was told bluntly to make a choice between the eagles disappearing or losing his job. They gave me 3 days to think it over. A choice was hard to make. Michael spent one sleepless night considering what had happened. Eagles became a part of his life. He felt responsible for them. Work was the only source of income at the same time. He couldn't afford losing her. The next day, Michael appeared with a plan. He gathered several colleagues. Everybody took pistols with blank cartridges. The plan was simple: to create enough noise to make the birds go away. This seemed to be the only humane solution. The operation began well before the morning sun. Around the port, the shots of blank rang, panicking the eagles up in the air. Their wings cut through the air as the birds disappeared fast behind the horizon. After that, the port returned to its normal life. Work resumed, and Michael retained his position. But his heart was beyond restive. He constantly checked for the signal of the GPS tracker. In a few days, he was brought to a small house on the outskirts by the signal. It was an old one-story house with a large garden. The same eagles sat in the trees around the house. They seemed to be calm, for they have found a shelter here. He made up his mind and approached to the front door. His hand was trembling when pressing the bell. I heard footsteps outside the door. A middle-aged woman opened the door. She widened her eyes when she saw Michael. The woman turned pale and staggered, but fortunately Michael managed to support her. Then they went into the house. In the living room, there were photographs on the walls. There was a man who looked very much like Michael. He fed the same eagles. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Anderson. Her husband, James, died 2 months ago. He was a marine biologist, and for the past 5 years, he had been studying the behavior of eagles. The birds had become their life. They flew here every day. The story of James and the eagles started with the rescue of an injured bird. He found an eagle which has one of his wings broken. He came out. Others joined him, the cured bird. James kept detailed records of each eagle. Sarah showed Michael her husband's diaries. They contained all the information about eagles: their habits, characters, food preferences. James gave each bird a name. The biologist spent a lot of time with them, studying their behavior. James' sudden death from a heart attack left both Sarah and the eagles in complete disarray. The birds continued to fly to the house. It was as if they were looking for their friend there. Sarah could not bring herself to feed them. It reminded her too much of her dead husband. When the eagles saw Michael in the port, they recognized him as James' traits. The resemblance was really striking. The same facial features, the same posture, even the movements were similar. They soon started to follow him, just as they did James. Sarah had an unusual solution. Michael could come to them on weekends. In such a way, the eagles would keep in touch with James' house and be able to see Michael at the same time. Thus, everybody would help both birds and people. The first meeting together was held in Sarah's garden. Michael brought fresh meat. The eagles came down from the trees, not at all afraid of the man. Sarah watched with tears in her eyes. At this moment, for her, the past and the present came together. Gradually, a new tradition emerged. Every weekend, Michael came to see Sarah. Together, they fed the eagles. Sarah talked about James. Michael shared his observations. A real friendship struck up between them. The eagles were no longer seen in the port. They knew the new pecking order. On weekends, the birds would come together in Sarah's garden. During the week, they hunted around the area just like regular wild birds. Sarah took Michael to her husband's research materials. In James' office, there were hundreds of photographs. Each shot depicted a certain part of every eagle's life. What James did was draw detailed maps of their migrations. He recorded his observations by writing them down. The oldest was 12 years old. James called him the king because he was the very first bird that he saved. The king had a scar on his beak. He would always be there first, and he would be the last one to leave. In the group, there were 2 young eagles. They had appeared in the group a year ago. James speculated that these were the babies of older birds. The young eaglets were much playful. They often performed air shows over the garden. Sarah gradually began to remake the garden. She set up special perches for birds. New feeders appeared. In the far corner of the garden, she made a small pool. The place turned into a real bird's paradise. Michael also helped in arranging the garden. His experience in the port was useful. He strengthened structures for birds. He made new platforms for feeding. He repaired old perches. The neighbors gradually got used to the unusual situation. Many came to see the eagles. Children from nearby houses often stood by the fence. Sarah gave them small excursions, telling them about eagles. Each eagle had its own character. One bird liked to sit on a particular branch of an apple tree. The other was always waiting for her portion last. The third let out a weird cry when she saw Michael. A year had passed since the first meeting between Michael and the eagles. Much had changed within this year. Sarah came out of her depression after the death of her husband. Michael found a new meaning in life. The eagles found a new home. At the port, Michael's story reached legendary proportions. The stories of a man who made friends with eagles were listened to with big surprise by the new workers. Some still did not believe this incredible story. Sarah started to systematize her husband's notes. She wanted to publish a book concerning his research about birds. Michael helped with modern observations. Together, they continued James' work. One day, they found James' unfinished paper. He wrote about the unusual social behavior of eagles, that they are able to form strong bonds not only with each other, but even with people. The king became especially attached to Michael. He often sat next to him when Michael worked in the garden. Sometimes the eagle would follow his car to the main road. A special bond was established between them. Sarah noticed that the young eagles had begun to build nests nearby. This was unusual for wild birds. They chose tall trees within the site of the house. Their population grew naturally. Michael and Sarah spent more and more time together. They were united not only by caring for birds. They talked a lot, shared memories. A very strong friendship arose between them. At the end of the second year, a place around Sarah's home turned into an unofficial nature reserve. Local authorities are already interested in the project. They helped them establish an educational facility. Each evening, as the sun went down, Michael remembered how a chain of events had brought him to this place. 1 second, a random moment in time, changed so many lives. A single lonely eagle on the pier became the beginning of an amazing story. Sarah would say many times that James would be happy to see all this. His dream of creating a place where people and birds can live in harmony has come true, even if not in the way he planned. Now, when someone asked Michael about his unusual story, he just smiled and invited people to come and see it with their own eyes. In this place, everyone could see that miracles happen. You just need to be open to them.